Since September 7th, 2008, the U.S. taxpayers have sunk $153 billion into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And according to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the final tab could be as high as $363 billion. As if the news couldn't get any worse for American people, an investigation undertaken by this subcommittee has discovered that the taxpayers have spent more than $162 million defending Freddie and Fannie and their former top executives in civil lawsuits accusing them of fraud. This includes over tens of millions of dollars for former executives who knowingly and purposely manipulated earnings to increase their own compensation and whose actions directly contributed to the demise of the GSEs. The history of Fannie Mae under the management of Franklin Raines, Timothy Howard, and Leanne Spencer is a story of abusing their positions to use assets of the enterprise to further their own interest and careers. The abuse by these individuals was so far-ranging that Fannie and Freddie were forced to restate earnings by over $10 billion, which was followed by a $400 million settlement with the SEC and OFAO, and losses of tens of billions of dollars in market capitalization for Fannie's shareholders. Unfortunately, today, years after they were forced out of the company, these misdeeds, Franklin Raines and his management team have continued their abuse. This time, however, it's against the United States taxpayers. As a result of my inquiries, I have discovered that taxpayers have advanced $24.2 million in legal expenses against civil lawsuits accusing them of securities fraud. These three individuals, who collectively earned $150 million in total compensation from 1998 to 2003, are not just assured of indemnification, but are actually being advanced funds, which means that they have no expense in just running up the tab for the U.S. taxpayers. Moreover, their attorneys have every incentive to keep the case going for as long as possible to maximize their fees, which already are in the tens of millions of dollars. One case in particular has been ongoing since 2004 and has included over 120 fact depositions, various expert depositions, and millions of discovery documents. Unfortunately, the end is nowhere in sight. This open-ended taxpayer commitment was approved by FHFA, the very entity that has an obligation to conserve the assets of the GSE in such a way to minimize taxpayers' exposure. It was approved even though Fannie Mae bylaws clearly state that the indemnification shall not apply to directors and officers who breach their duty of loyalty to shareholders or engage in intentional misconduct, two measures that Franklin Raines and his management team clearly violated. It is also worth noting that Section 4617 of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act, or HERA, FHFA has the power to repudiate the indemnification agreements for these individuals. With all of that being said, even FHFA still feels obligated to advance legal expenses for Mr. Raines, Mr. Howard, and Mrs. Spencer. The contracts state that they are entitled to the advancement of reasonable legal fees, and I think all of my colleagues can agree that these fees are not, that many of these fees are not reasonable given the mounting taxpayer exposure. The delay tactic of the defendants and the fact that many of these security-related lawsuits have no end in sight. One thing I feel very strongly about is that this subcommittee needs to do everything it can to minimize further taxpayer exposure associated with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I would like to work with Mr. DeMarco and FHFA to make sure that they are equipped with all the tools necessary to accomplish this objective. In closing, I would like to state that this particular topic has raised many more questions about continuing operations of GSEs, and accordingly, this will more than likely not be the last of many hearings to happen in the future. Along these lines, I'm also looking forward to working with Chairman Baucus and Chairman Garrett to take a look at take a serious look at whether conservatorship of the GSEs is the best structure to protect the U.S. taxpayers. And with that, I yield to the gentleman, Mr. Copper.